The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of downtown Portland when Marcus Thompson first realized that everything they thought they knew about the infected was wrong. The former Marine sergeant crouched behind an overturned delivery truck, his weathered hands gripping a modified hunting rifle as he watched three figures move through the intersection ahead. At first glance, they appeared to be typical infected, the telltale pale skin, the jerky movements, the glazed eyes that had become humanity's nightmare over the past 6 months. But something was different about these three, something that made Marcus's combat-trained instincts scream danger in ways he hadn't felt since his tours overseas. The infected weren't shambling aimlessly like the others. They were communicating. One of them, a woman in a torn business suit, raised her hand and pointed toward a specific building. The other two nodded and immediately changed direction, moving with purpose rather than the mindless hunger that had characterized every infected encounter for half a year. Marcus blinked hard, certain he was seeing things. The infected didn't plan. They didn't coordinate. They were supposed to be driven by nothing but an insatiable need to feed, their higher brain functions completely destroyed by whatever virus or parasite had turned them into monsters. But these three were different. As Marcus watched in growing horror, the woman gestured again, and the other two infected, a young man in construction gear and an elderly person in hospital scrubs, split up and began approaching the building from different angles. It was a tactical maneuver, the kind of coordinated approach Marcus had used countless times in military operations. His blood ran cold as the implications hit him like a freight train. If the infected could think, if they could plan and strategize, then every safe zone, every defensive position, every survival strategy that humanity had developed over the past 6 months was suddenly obsolete. 20 blocks away, Dr. Ashley Rodriguez was experiencing her own moment of terrifying revelation. The biochemist had been studying tissue samples from infected subjects for months, trying to understand the pathogen that had brought civilization to its knees. Her makeshift laboratory in the basement of Portland General Hospital had become a beacon of hope for the survivors who believed that science might eventually provide answers, maybe even a cure. But the data she was seeing on her computer screen challenged everything she thought she understood about the infection. The neural tissue samples showed something impossible, not the widespread cell death and protein degradation that characterized the infected, but rather a bizarre form of cellular reorganization. Synaptic pathways that should have been destroyed were instead being rewired, creating new connections that seemed to enhance certain cognitive functions while suppressing others. The infected weren't losing their minds, they were having their minds rebuilt for a different purpose. Ashley's hands trembled as she cross-referenced her findings with behavioral reports from survivor groups across the region. The scattered accounts of organized infected movements, tactical retreats, and coordinated attacks that she had dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations suddenly took on a chilling new significance. In the residential district of Southeast Portland, Jake Williams was leading a supply run that would change everything. The former high school teacher had become an unlikely leader among the survivor groups, his calm demeanor and problem-solving skills proving invaluable in the chaos of the post-outbreak world. Today's mission was supposed to be routine, a quick raid on an abandoned pharmacy for medical supplies that their group desperately needed. Jake had chosen this particular location because surveillance over the past week had shown it to be clear of infected, a safe target for his team of 6 survivors. But as they approached the pharmacy, Jake noticed something that made his stomach drop. The infected that had been scattered randomly throughout the neighborhood just days before were now positioned in what could only be described as a perimeter. They weren't wandering aimlessly, they were standing guard. Each infected was stationed at a key vantage point, creating overlapping fields of observation that would make any approach to the pharmacy visible. It was a defensive formation, and Jake realized with mounting dread that they had walked into a trap. The revelation came too late. As Jake raised his hand to signal his team to retreat, infected figures emerged from concealment with military precision. They had been hidden in doorways, behind vehicles, even in storm drains, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their ambush. But what terrified Jake most wasn't their numbers or their positioning, it was the fact that they moved to cut off escape routes first, hurting the humans like livestock rather than simply attacking. These infected understood strategy, and they were implementing it with deadly effectiveness. The old rules of survival were dead, and humanity was about to learn just how dangerous an intelligent enemy could be. Jake's team found themselves caught in a nightmare that defied every survival instinct they had developed over the past 6 months. The infected moved with calculated precision, forcing the humans into an ever-shrinking circle near the pharmacy's entrance. What chilled Jake to his core wasn't just their coordination, but their restraint. The infected could have overwhelmed them immediately, but instead they seemed to be studying their prey, learning from their movements and reactions. Rebecca Martinez, a former police officer who had become Jake's second-in-command, pressed her back against the pharmacy's glass door and whispered urgently into her radio, trying to warn the other survivor groups scattered across the city about this new development. The infected leader, Jake was certain now that there was a hierarchy among them, stepped forward with deliberate slowness. It was a middle-aged man in a postal worker's uniform, his skin bearing the characteristic pallor of the infection, but his eyes held something that made Jake's blood freeze. Intelligence. Purpose. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing Jake's leadership position within the group, then made a series of subtle hand gestures to the other infected. They responded immediately, adjusting their positions to create what any military tactician would recognize as a capture formation rather than a kill formation. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson was racing through the empty streets on his motorcycle, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed at the intersection. The 3 infected he had observed weren't isolated anomalies, they were part of something larger, something organized. As he navigated through the abandoned cityscape, Marcus began noticing patterns that had been invisible before. Infected weren't randomly distributed throughout the city as everyone had assumed. They were positioned strategically, covering major routes and supply lines that the survivor communities relied upon. It was as if someone, or something, had been mapping human movement patterns and adjusting infected placement accordingly. His radio crackled to life with Rebecca's frantic transmission about Jake's team being trapped. Marcus gunned his engine toward their location, but what he saw along the way made him realize the scope of the threat they were facing. Groups of infected were moving with purpose through the streets, not wandering aimlessly as they had for months, but traveling in formation toward specific destinations. They were converging on known survivor strongholds, and Marcus understood with growing horror that this wasn't random evolution, it was a coordinated assault on human resistance. Back in her laboratory, Dr. Ashley Rodriguez was frantically correlating her research findings with the emergency radio chatter flooding the airwaves. Her analysis of the neural tissue samples had revealed something that contradicted every assumption about the infection. The pathogen wasn't destroying cognitive function, it was selectively eliminating certain aspects of human consciousness while enhancing others. Empathy, self-preservation, and individual identity were being systematically erased, but problem-solving abilities, pattern recognition, and tactical thinking were being amplified beyond normal human capacity. The infected weren't mindless monsters, they were becoming something like a collective intelligence with specialized roles and coordinated objectives. The radio reports streaming in from across Portland painted a terrifying picture. Survivor groups that had remained hidden for months were suddenly being discovered and surrounded. Safe houses that had never been compromised were under siege. Supply caches that only trusted community members knew about were being systematically raided. The infected weren't just hunting humans anymore, they were dismantling the entire survivor infrastructure with surgical precision. Ashley realized that they had been studying human behavior patterns for months, learning and adapting, waiting for the moment when they had gathered enough intelligence to strike effectively. At the pharmacy, Jake's situation was deteriorating rapidly. The infected had produced lengths of rope from somewhere, another indication of planning that sent chills down his spine. They weren't trying to kill his team, they were trying to capture them alive. Tommy Chen, a young mechanic who had joined their group just weeks earlier, made a desperate break for a side alley, but the infected anticipated his move perfectly. 3 of them converged on his escape route while 2 others herded him back toward the main group. The coordination was flawless, suggesting communication methods that went beyond anything humans had previously observed in the infected. The postal worker who seemed to be leading the infected stepped closer to Jake, and for the first time since the outbreak began, an infected individual attempted to communicate with words rather than growls or shrieks. The voice was raspy and distorted, but unmistakably human speech. "You will come with us." The words were delivered with effort, as if the creature was struggling to access language centers of its brain that had been rewired for other purposes. But the message was clear, and it represented a paradigm shift that would change everything about humanity's fight for survival. Jake looked into the creature's eyes and saw something that made his hands shake. Recognition. This infected individual wasn't just speaking to him, it knew who he was. It had been watching him, learning his patterns, understanding his role in the survivor community. The infected weren't just developing intelligence, they were developing intelligence specifically focused on understanding and countering human resistance efforts. As the circle of infected tightened around his team, Jake realized that humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting against an enemy that was learning to think several steps ahead of them, an enemy that was turning their own strategic thinking against them in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The rope felt coarse against Jake's wrists as the infected bound his team with practiced efficiency. The postal worker creature continued its labored attempts at communication, each word seeming to require tremendous effort as if it was forcing damaged vocal cords to remember their purpose. "Others are waiting," it managed, pointing toward a delivery truck that had been positioned strategically at the end of the block. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. The infected had vehicles now, they had predetermined meeting points, and most terrifyingly, they had plans that extended beyond the immediate moment. This wasn't random violence or hunger-driven attacks, this was systematic capture and transport to unknown destinations. Rebecca struggled against her restraints while scanning the area for any opportunity to escape, her police training automatically cataloging potential weapons and exit routes. But what caught her attention wasn't tactical options, it was the behavior of the infected themselves. They weren't celebrating their successful capture or showing any emotion at all. Instead, they moved with the cold efficiency of workers completing an assigned task. One infected methodically searched through the team's equipment, setting aside weapons and radios with what appeared to be understanding of their function. Another was carefully documenting something in a notebook with shaky but deliberate handwriting, as if recording data about their captives for later analysis. Marcus Thompson's motorcycle roared around the corner just as the infected were preparing to load Jake's team into the delivery truck. His military experience kicked in immediately as he assessed the tactical situation. 6 infected, positioned to provide mutual support and cover. 1 truck running and ready for immediate departure. Captives secured but not yet loaded. Marcus had perhaps 30 seconds before the window of opportunity closed forever. He drew his sidearm while maintaining control of the speeding motorcycle, knowing that precision would be more important than firepower in a rescue scenario with friendly forces at risk. The infected reacted to Marcus's arrival with startling coordination. Instead of the frenzied, disorganized response typical of infected encounters, they immediately moved to defensive positions while continuing their primary objective of loading the captives. 2 infected took cover behind parked cars and began what could only be described as suppressing fire using makeshift projectiles, while the others accelerated their loading procedure. Marcus realized with growing alarm that these infected understood tactical priorities, they were willing to sacrifice individual units to complete their mission, suggesting a level of strategic thinking that made them infinitely more dangerous than mindless predators. Dr. Ashley Rodriguez had abandoned her laboratory and was racing through the hospital corridors with a portable case containing her most critical research data. The emergency broadcasts flooding the radio channels had made one thing terrifyingly clear: this coordinated attack wasn't limited to Portland. Similar reports were coming in from Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, and every major survivor stronghold on the West Coast. The infected weren't just developing intelligence locally, they were sharing information across vast distances, coordinating a continent-wide operation that suggested communication networks beyond anything previously imagined. Her research had revealed the biological mechanism, but the scope of implementation was far beyond what she had theorized possible. As she reached the hospital's emergency exit, Ashley encountered something that stopped her cold. 3 infected were waiting in the parking garage, but they weren't attacking the few remaining medical staff who were fleeing the building. Instead, they were selectively targeting individuals, checking faces against what appeared to be photographs or sketches. They were looking for specific people, and Ashley realized with mounting horror that she was likely one of their targets. Her research into the infection's neural effects had made her valuable to whatever intelligence was directing the infected operations. They didn't want to kill her, they wanted to capture her and her knowledge. Back at the pharmacy, Marcus's rescue attempt had devolved into a running firefight that showcased the infected's newfound tactical capabilities. They had demonstrated understanding of cover and concealment, crossfire patterns, and most disturbingly, they showed the ability to adapt their strategy in real time as Marcus changed his approach. When he tried to flank left, infected appeared from previously empty buildings to block his advance. When he attempted to create a distraction with an improvised explosive, they ignored the noise and maintained focus on their primary objective. These weren't reflexive responses, they were calculated decisions made by an intelligence that was learning to counter human military tactics. Jake managed to work one hand partially free from his restraints and was attempting to signal Marcus when the postal worker infected approached him again. This time, its speech was slightly clearer, as if practice was improving its ability to access human language centers. Dr. Rodriguez, location, required, it said, staring directly into Jake's eyes with an intensity that suggested it knew Jake had information about Ashley's whereabouts. The infected weren't just capturing random survivors, they were systematically targeting key individuals whose skills and knowledge would be valuable for reasons that remained terrifyingly unclear. The delivery truck's engine revved, and Jake realized that regardless of Marcus's heroic rescue attempt, time was running out. But what terrified him most wasn't the prospect of capture, it was the growing understanding that this coordinated operation represented just the beginning of something much larger. The infected had evolved beyond simple predators into something that combined the relentless hunger of their original nature with the strategic thinking capacity of military planners. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting against an enemy that was learning to think like them while retaining advantages that no human military force could match. The war for the future of the species had just begun, and the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed in ways that no one was prepared to handle. The delivery truck lurched forward just as Marcus unleashed a devastating barrage of gunfire that dropped 2 of the infected guards, but his tactical victory felt hollow as he watched Jake's team disappearing into the vehicle's cargo bay. The remaining infected didn't flee or show any signs of the panic that Marcus had learned to exploit in previous encounters. Instead, they executed what appeared to be a planned withdrawal, using smoke grenades that created a thick concealment cloud while the truck accelerated toward predetermined escape routes. Marcus pursued on his motorcycle, but quickly discovered that the infected had anticipated chase scenarios. Infected sentries positioned along the route forced him to take evasive action at crucial moments, allowing the truck to gain distance and eventually disappear into a network of side streets that seemed designed specifically for this purpose. Dr. Ashley Rodriguez had managed to evade the infected hunters in the hospital parking garage by hiding in a maintenance tunnel that connected to the city's storm drain system. As she crawled through the narrow concrete passages with her research data, she tried to piece together the horrifying puzzle that was emerging. The infected weren't just developing intelligence, they were demonstrating organizational capabilities that suggested a centralized command structure. The coordinated timing of attacks across multiple cities, the targeted selection of specific individuals, and the sophisticated tactical responses all pointed to something that challenged every assumption about what the infected could become. Her research had shown neural pathway reconstruction, but she hadn't anticipated that this biological change could result in collective intelligence on such a massive scale. Above ground, the city of Portland was transforming into something unrecognizable. Traditional safe zones that had protected survivor communities for months were being systematically compromised not through brute force assaults, but through carefully planned operations that seemed to understand each location's specific vulnerabilities. The infected were using knowledge of building layouts, defensive positions, and supply routes that could only have been gathered through extended surveillance and analysis. Marcus received radio reports from across the metropolitan area describing scenarios that defied everything survivors thought they knew about infected behavior: coordinated multi-front attacks, the use of diversionary tactics, and most disturbing of all, infected individuals who seemed to be assuming specialized roles within their operations. The storm drain system provided Ashley with a temporary refuge, but also with an opportunity to observe infected behavior from a unique vantage point. Through drainage grates, she could see infected groups moving through the streets in formations that resembled military patrols. They were conducting sweeps of buildings using search patterns that maximized coverage while minimizing exposure to potential human counterattacks. Some infected carried equipment that they had clearly gathered from previous operations: radios, maps, even laptop computers that they handled with surprising care. Ashley realized that the infected weren't just hunting humans, they were gathering intelligence and resources for purposes that remained ominously unclear. Marcus had regrouped with other survivor leaders at a previously secure communications center, where emergency broadcasts painted a picture of global catastrophe that went far beyond local concerns. Reports from London, Tokyo, Sydney, and Buenos Aires described identical scenarios: intelligent infected conducting coordinated capture operations targeting specific individuals with scientific, military, or leadership backgrounds. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting communication networks between infected populations that spanned continents. Traditional theories about the infection's progression were crumbling as evidence mounted that whatever had created the infected was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison, a career military officer who had been coordinating survivor defenses for the Pacific Northwest, struggled to comprehend intelligence reports that defied every principle of enemy behavior analysis he had learned over 20 years of service. The infected were demonstrating command and control capabilities that rivaled professional military organizations, but with response times and coordination efficiency that exceeded human limitations. They seemed to share information instantaneously across vast distances, allowing them to adapt tactics in real time based on lessons learned from operations hundreds of miles away. Harrison realized that humanity was facing an enemy that combined the relentless determination of the infected with strategic thinking capabilities that might actually surpass human military planning. In her underground refuge, Ashley made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. Using her portable laboratory equipment to analyze water samples from the storm drain system, she detected trace amounts of the same neural-affecting compounds that she had identified in infected tissue samples. The infection wasn't spreading just through direct contact anymore, it was somehow contaminating the water supply with substances that could potentially influence human brain chemistry. The implications were staggering. The infected might be attempting to create conditions that would make human resistance less effective, possibly even preparing to convert the remaining population through environmental exposure rather than traditional infection methods. The radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. Jake's voice, distorted and weak, came through on an emergency frequency that survivor groups used for dire communications. "This is Jake Williams. We're being held in what appears to be a converted warehouse complex in the industrial district. The infected, they're keeping us alive for a reason. They have other humans here, scientists and engineers, people they've been collecting. They're making them work on something, some kind of project. The infected aren't just smart now, they're trying to become smarter. They're using human knowledge to enhance whatever they've already become." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Marcus and the other survivors to grapple with the horrifying realization that the infected weren't just hunting humans for food or elimination. They were systematically harvesting human intelligence and expertise for their own advancement. The enemy wasn't just learning to think like humans, they were trying to think better than humans by incorporating the best of human knowledge into their own rapidly evolving cognitive capabilities. The war for survival had become a race against time, with humanity fighting not just for their lives but for their very relevance in a world where their greatest advantage, their intelligence, was being systematically copied, improved upon, and turned against them by an enemy that showed no signs of slowing its terrifying evolution. The warehouse complex that held Jake and his team defied every assumption about infected capabilities. The building had been systematically modified with security measures that demonstrated not just intelligence, but engineering expertise that seemed impossible for creatures that had been mindless predators just months before. Reinforced barriers blocked potential escape routes, surveillance equipment monitored every corridor, and most unsettling of all, the infected guards rotated shifts with military precision. Jake counted at least 40 human captives in the facility, all of whom possessed specialized knowledge that the infected apparently valued. Engineers, doctors, computer programmers, and military specialists were being kept in surprisingly adequate conditions, provided with food, water, and even basic medical care. Dr. Patricia Kellerman, a former NASA systems engineer who had been captured 3 weeks earlier, approached Jake during what appeared to be a scheduled rest period for the human captives. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she explained what the infected were forcing the captured humans to construct. "They're building some kind of communication network," she said, glancing nervously at the infected guards who seemed to understand that the humans needed to communicate but were monitoring conversations for security purposes. "Advanced radio systems, computer networks, even what looks like satellite communication equipment. They bring us technical manuals and schematics, and they expect us to make it all work together. The terrifying part is that they seem to understand what they're asking for." Meanwhile, Ashley had emerged from the storm drain system into an abandoned subway tunnel where she discovered evidence that the infected's intelligence-gathering operations were far more extensive than anyone had realized. Maps covered the tunnel walls, marked with precise locations of survivor communities, supply routes, and defensive positions. The maps weren't crude sketches, they were detailed tactical analyses that included information about personnel numbers, weapons capabilities, and leadership structures. Some maps showed red zones marked as completed acquisitions, while others displayed green zones labeled as priority targets. Ashley realized with growing horror that the infected had been conducting systematic intelligence gathering for months, preparing for this coordinated campaign with the thoroughness of a professional military operation. Marcus had assembled a rapid response team consisting of 12 survivors with military or law enforcement backgrounds, but their reconnaissance of the warehouse complex revealed the scope of the challenge they faced. The infected had established defensive positions that maximized their advantages while minimizing human tactical options. Sniper positions commanded all approaches, patrol routes eliminated dead zones where humans might establish concealment, and the facility's layout forced any assault force into predetermined killing zones. Most disturbing was the evidence that the infected had been studying human military tactics and implementing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize traditional assault strategies. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison coordinated with Ashley via encrypted radio communications as she transmitted her intelligence findings from the subway tunnel. Her discovery of the infected's mapping and analysis capabilities forced Harrison to reconsider everything about their defensive strategies. If the infected possessed detailed intelligence about every survivor's stronghold, then traditional military doctrine about secure bases and fallback positions was meaningless. "We're not fighting an enemy that's learning our tactics," Harrison told Ashley during their communication. "We're fighting an enemy that already knows our tactics better than we do. They've been studying us while we thought they were mindless predators." Inside the warehouse, Jake witnessed something that made his blood freeze. An infected individual was standing before a large computer screen, using a keyboard with deliberate, practiced movements. The creature was accessing databases, cross-referencing information, and manipulating complex software with a level of technical competency that should have been impossible. When the infected noticed Jake watching, it turned and spoke with the same labored but increasingly clear speech pattern that Jake had encountered during his capture. "Human, knowledge, integration, proceeding, successfully," it said, then returned to its computer work with focused determination that suggested specific objectives rather than random exploration. Dr. Kellerman explained to Jake that the infected weren't just using human knowledge, they were systematically absorbing and improving upon it. "They make us teach them things, but they learn faster than any human student I've ever encountered," she whispered. "Yesterday, I spent an hour explaining satellite communication protocols to one of them. This morning, that same infected was teaching those protocols to 3 others, and they had already identified improvements to the system design that I hadn't considered. They're not just copying our knowledge, they're enhancing it with capabilities that go beyond normal human limitations. Ashley's exploration of the subway tunnel system revealed a network of infected facilities that extended throughout the metropolitan area. The infected had been using underground passages to move personnel and equipment while remaining invisible to human surveillance. Each facility seemed to serve a specific function in their overall operation, some focused on intelligence analysis, others on equipment modification, and still others on what appeared to be research and development activities. The scope of their infrastructure suggested planning and resource allocation capabilities that rivaled government agencies, but implemented with a speed and efficiency that human organizations could never match. The radio brought news that sent chills through every survivor community. Reports from international sources indicated that the coordinated capture operations weren't limited to scientific and technical personnel. The infected were systematically targeting individuals with knowledge of agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and social organization. They weren't just trying to understand human technology, they were attempting to comprehend and improve upon human civilization itself. The implications were staggering. The infected might be planning to create their own version of organized society, one that incorporated the best aspects of human achievement while eliminating what they perceived as human weaknesses. As night fell over Portland, Marcus realized that humanity was facing an enemy that had evolved beyond every nightmare scenario they had prepared for during the initial outbreak. The infected weren't just surviving, they were advancing at a rate that made human adaptation impossible. Every day they delayed their response was another day for the infected to absorb more human knowledge, improve their tactical capabilities, and expand their mysterious project. The war for survival had become a race against an enemy that was learning faster than humanity could fight back. The breakthrough came when Dr. Kellerman discovered the true purpose behind the infected's forced collaboration with human captives. During her assigned work period, she had been instructed to help design what appeared to be a sophisticated biological research facility. The infected provided her with detailed specifications that demonstrated understanding of advanced laboratory procedures, sterile environments, and genetic analysis equipment. But when she realized what they intended to research, Patricia's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The infected weren't just trying to understand human knowledge, they were attempting to accelerate their own evolutionary process using human scientific methods to enhance their already formidable cognitive abilities. Jake observed the infected's behavior patterns during shift changes and noticed something that gave him the first glimmer of hope since their capture. Despite their enhanced intelligence, the infected still retained certain biological limitations from their original transformation. They required rest periods, though much shorter than humans needed, and during these intervals their cognitive performance decreased noticeably. More importantly, they seemed to experience something analogous to fatigue when performing complex mental tasks for extended periods. These vulnerabilities were minimal, but they represented potential weaknesses that could be exploited if humans could devise the right strategy. Ashley's underground reconnaissance had led her to a discovery that changed everything about humanity's understanding of their enemy. In an abandoned metro station, she found evidence of infected attempting to establish manufacturing capabilities. They had assembled production lines for creating their own equipment rather than simply scavenging human technology. The implications were staggering. The infected were working toward complete independence from human infrastructure, suggesting long-term planning that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives. They weren't just trying to defeat humanity, they were building the foundation for their own technological civilization. Marcus received intelligence reports that forced him to completely restructure his rescue planning. Satellite imagery provided by military contacts revealed that the warehouse complex was just one node in a vast network of infected facilities spreading across the Pacific Northwest. Each facility appeared to serve a specialized function, connected by underground tunnels and communication networks that enabled rapid coordination across hundreds of miles. The infected had essentially created their own parallel infrastructure while humanity remained focused on defending isolated survivor communities that were now completely exposed to enemy intelligence gathering. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison coordinated emergency meetings with survivor leaders from across the region via secure communication channels, but the news from other areas painted an increasingly desperate picture. Traditional military strategies were proving ineffective against an enemy that anticipated human tactical responses and had prepared countermeasures for standard assault procedures. Worse, the infected were demonstrating the ability to learn from each engagement, rapidly adapting their defensive strategies to neutralize techniques that had worked in previous operations. Harrison realized that humanity needed to develop completely new approaches to warfare against an enemy that was essentially reverse-engineering human military doctrine in real time. Inside the warehouse complex, Jake noticed that some of the infected were exhibiting increasingly sophisticated social behaviors that suggested the emergence of specialized roles within their community structure. Certain infected appeared to function as leaders, making decisions that others followed without question. Others seemed to serve as technical specialists, focusing exclusively on specific aspects of their technological projects. Most disturbing was the presence of infected individuals who seemed dedicated to studying human behavior, observing the captives with an intensity that suggested psychological analysis rather than simple guard duty. Dr. Kellerman made a discovery that terrified her more than anything she had witnessed since the outbreak began. The infected had provided her with research data showing genetic analysis of their own tissue samples. They weren't just randomly evolving, they were systematically studying their own biological processes and identifying ways to enhance their transformation further. The data showed evidence of controlled mutations being introduced into new infected individuals, suggesting that they had developed the ability to direct their own evolutionary path rather than relying on natural selection. They were essentially designing improved versions of themselves using human scientific knowledge combined with their own biological advantages. Ashley's exploration revealed communication equipment that suggested the infected were in contact with similar operations across multiple continents. Radio transmissions in coded formats were being sent and received on frequencies that required sophisticated understanding of electronic communications. The infected weren't just coordinating locally, they were part of a global network that was sharing information, resources, and strategic planning across vast distances. Humanity was facing a worldwide enemy that possessed communication capabilities superior to most government agencies, combined with tactical flexibility that made them nearly impossible to predict or counter. The situation deteriorated further when Marcus intercepted infected communications that revealed they were actively monitoring human radio traffic. Every emergency broadcast, every coordination meeting, every strategic discussion was being overheard and analyzed by an enemy that understood human language and could interpret tactical communications better than many human operators. The infected weren't just ahead of human planning, they were listening to human plans in real time and developing countermeasures faster than humans could implement their strategies. As reports flooded in from around the world, a terrifying pattern emerged. The infected weren't just capturing humans with technical knowledge, they were systematically targeting individuals with leadership experience, strategic planning capabilities, and organizational skills. They were essentially harvesting human expertise in governance, logistics, and social coordination. Combined with their existing advantages in communication and tactical planning, this suggested that the infected were preparing to establish their own version of organized civilization, one that would incorporate the best aspects of human achievement while eliminating what they perceived as human inefficiencies and weaknesses. The radio crackled with an emergency transmission from Jake that sent chills through every survivor who heard it. His voice was strained but urgent as he reported what he had discovered about the infected's ultimate objective. "They're not trying to wipe us out," he whispered into a smuggled communication device. "They're trying to replace us. Everything they're building, everything they're learning, it's all preparation for creating their own version of human civilization. They want our knowledge, our technology, our organizational systems, but they want to run it all themselves. They're not just smarter than we thought, they're planning to become everything we are, but better." The infected's master plan became horrifyingly clear when Dr. Kellerman was forced to help construct what they called a neural integration facility. The blueprints she was given showed a laboratory designed not just for studying infected brain tissue, but for performing controlled transformations on human subjects. The infected weren't content with simply capturing human knowledge through coercion. They intended to convert key human experts while preserving their specialized abilities, essentially creating hybrid beings that combined infected advantages with human expertise. Patricia realized that she and the other captives weren't just prisoners, they were candidates for a transformation process that would make them into the founding members of a new infected intellectual class. Jake's attempts to organize resistance among the human captives revealed the sophisticated psychological warfare that the infected had developed. They had learned to exploit human social dynamics, using isolation and selective privileges to prevent coordinated resistance efforts. Some captives had been treated better than others, creating division and mistrust that made unified action nearly impossible. The infected demonstrated understanding of human psychological pressure points that suggested they had been studying behavioral psychology with the same systematic approach they applied to technology and tactics. They knew exactly how to keep their human assets compliant while extracting maximum value from their knowledge and skills. Marcus had assembled the largest coordinated resistance effort since the outbreak began, bringing together survivor groups from across Oregon and Washington for a desperate assault on the warehouse complex. But their planning sessions revealed just how thoroughly the infected had outmaneuvered human strategic thinking. Every proposed approach had been anticipated and countered. Traditional military tactics failed because the infected had studied them and prepared specific defenses. Guerrilla warfare techniques proved ineffective because the infected's communication networks allowed them to adapt faster than humans could improvise. Even psychological warfare was useless against an enemy that seemed immune to fear, fatigue, and demoralization. Ashley's underground investigation led her to what appeared to be the infected Central Command facility, a massive complex built within the city's old subway system that housed technology far beyond anything she had seen in the warehouse operations. Computer banks, communication arrays, and analysis equipment filled chambers that had been expertly excavated and reinforced by infected workers who demonstrated engineering capabilities that rivaled human construction teams. But what terrified Ashley most was discovering that the infected were using this facility to coordinate with similar operations not just across North America, but globally. Maps displayed infected territory spreading across every continent, with status reports indicating successful population conversion in major cities worldwide. The infected's global coordination became evident when simultaneous operations began targeting every remaining human stronghold within a 12-hour window. Reports flooded in from Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, and Chicago describing identical assault patterns that overwhelmed defender preparations and captured key personnel with surgical precision. The infected weren't just implementing a regional strategy, they were executing a continental conquest plan that had been developing for months while humans focused on local survival concerns. Traditional government communication networks had been completely compromised, leaving isolated survivor communities unable to coordinate effective resistance against an enemy that possessed superior intelligence gathering and strategic planning capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison received classified military intelligence that revealed the true scope of the catastrophe facing humanity. Infected populations had successfully infiltrated and compromised major infrastructure systems across North America, including power grids, communication networks, transportation systems, and water treatment facilities. They weren't just capturing territory, they were systematically taking control of the technological foundation that human civilization depended upon. Military installations that had seemed secure were reporting coordinated attacks by infected forces that demonstrated intimate knowledge of defensive layouts, personnel schedules, and weapons systems. The infected had essentially inherited human civilization's infrastructure while eliminating the humans who had built it. Inside the warehouse complex, Jake witnessed the horrifying efficiency of the infected's knowledge extraction process. Human experts were being systematically interviewed by infected individuals who possessed sophisticated understanding of technical subjects, asking precise questions that revealed deep comprehension of complex systems and procedures. The infected weren't just learning random information, they were targeting specific knowledge gaps in their understanding of human technology and social organization. Each interview session resulted in infected individuals becoming demonstrably more capable in specialized areas, as if they were literally absorbing and integrating human expertise into their own cognitive framework. Dr. Kellerman's forced collaboration revealed that the infected had developed biotechnology capabilities that exceeded current human scientific understanding. They had created enhanced transformation procedures that preserved specific human cognitive abilities while eliminating resistance to infected social integration. The neural integration facility she was helping to design would allow them to convert human experts while maintaining their specialized knowledge intact, essentially creating a hybrid workforce that combined infected advantages with human technical skills. The implications were staggering. The infected could potentially transform key human personnel while preserving their usefulness, creating a servant class of specialized workers under infected control. Ashley discovered communication logs that revealed the infected's timeline for completing their global transformation project. Phase 1, the capture of key human personnel and infrastructure, was nearly complete across most developed regions. Phase 2 involved the systematic conversion of captured humans into hybrid workers while eliminating remaining resistance centers. Phase 3 called for the establishment of infected civilization using modified human technology and organizational systems, with converted humans serving specialized roles under infected leadership. The infected weren't just conquering humanity, they were planning to build their own improved version of human civilization using the best aspects of human achievement while eliminating what they considered human weaknesses and inefficiencies. The radio crackled with Marcus's voice as he prepared to launch what might be humanity's last coordinated military action. All units, this is our final chance to disrupt their operation before they complete whatever they're building, he transmitted to assault teams. Positioned around the warehouse complex. Intelligence indicates they're hours away from activating some kind of transformation facility. If we can't stop them now, there may not be enough unconverted humans left to mount effective resistance. As Marcus gave the signal to begin the assault, he realized that humanity was betting everything on a desperate gamble against an enemy that had consistently demonstrated superiority in every engagement. The fate of human civilization hung in the balance of a battle against creatures that had learned to think better than the species that created them. The assault on the warehouse complex began with Marcus leading a coordinated attack that represented humanity's most sophisticated military operation since the outbreak, but within minutes it became clear that the infected had anticipated every aspect of their strategy. As human forces approached from multiple directions, infected defenders responded with tactics that seemed to predict each movement before it occurred. Smoke grenades, diversionary explosions, and coordinated fire teams proved useless against an enemy that had been monitoring human communications and had prepared specific countermeasures for every technique in the Survivor playbook. But Marcus had expected this, and his real strategy involved Ashley's simultaneous infiltration of the subway command center using intelligence she had gathered during her underground reconnaissance. While the warehouse assault served as a distraction, Ashley worked her way through maintenance tunnels toward the infected central communication hub, carrying improvised electromagnetic pulse devices that could potentially disrupt their coordination networks. Inside the warehouse, Jake felt the building shake as explosions echoed through the facility, but what surprised him was the infected guards' reaction. Instead of increased alertness or defensive positioning, they seemed to be following predetermined protocols that involved accelerating their transformation procedures. Dr. Kellerman was being forcibly moved toward the neural integration facility despite the ongoing assault, while other human captives were being processed through conversion chambers with mechanical efficiency that suggested the infected viewed the human attack as an expected development rather than a crisis. Jake realized with growing horror that the assault might actually be playing into the infected's timeline, forcing them to implement their final phase ahead of schedule but not preventing it from occurring. Ashley reached the subway command center just as infected technicians were initiating what appeared to be a global communication sequence, sending coordinated signals to infected operations worldwide. The facility hummed with electronic activity as displays showed infected territories across every continent receiving and acknowledging transmission protocols. Ashley understood that she was witnessing the activation of the infected's worldwide network, the moment when isolated regional operations would become a unified global entity with unprecedented coordination capabilities. Her electromagnetic pulse devices represented humanity's only chance to disrupt this critical communication node, but using them would also eliminate her ability to gather further intelligence about infected capabilities and intentions. Marcus's assault teams had penetrated the warehouse's outer defenses but found themselves facing infected defenders who fought with suicidal determination to protect specific areas of the facility. The infected weren't trying to win the battle, they were trying to buy time for critical operations to complete. Human soldiers reported encounters with infected individuals who continued fighting even after sustaining injuries that should have been incapacitating, suggesting that their enhanced intelligence came with equally enhanced pain tolerance and combat endurance. The warehouse had become a fortress where every corridor was defended by enemies who possessed both tactical sophistication and physical advantages that made conventional military operations nearly impossible. Jake managed to break free from his restraints during the chaos of the assault and reached Dr. Kellerman just as infected technicians were preparing to begin her transformation procedure. What he saw in the neural integration facility defied every assumption about infected capabilities. The equipment was sophisticated beyond anything he had imagined, combining human medical technology with modifications that seemed to enhance precision and effectiveness far beyond original specifications. Infected operators worked the machinery with expertise that suggested extensive practice, while monitoring systems displayed neurological data that indicated they understood brain chemistry better than most human neuroscientists. Jake realized that the infected had been perfecting their transformation process for months, and Kellerman might be among the first subjects to undergo a procedure that would preserve her scientific knowledge while eliminating her resistance to infected authority. Ashley activated her electromagnetic pulse devices just as the infected's global communication sequence reached critical transmission phase, sending devastating electronic disruption through the subway command center that disabled computer systems and communication arrays throughout the facility. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Infected operations worldwide lost coordination capabilities, forcing them to operate independently rather than as components of a unified global network. But Ashley quickly discovered that her sabotage had unintended consequences. The communication disruption also prevented infected facilities from receiving abort signals for transformation procedures that were already in progress, meaning that conversion operations would continue without central coordination or safety protocols. The warehouse assault reached its climax when Marcus's team breached the neural integration facility just as Jake was attempting to disconnect Dr. Kellerman from the transformation apparatus. The infected defenders fought with desperate ferocity to protect their conversion equipment, but human forces had the advantage of surprise and superior firepower in the confined space. However, their victory came too late to prevent the completion of several transformation procedures. Patricia Kellerman had been partially converted before the process was interrupted, leaving her in a biological state that was neither fully human nor fully infected. She retained her scientific knowledge and human personality, but also demonstrated enhanced cognitive processing abilities and apparent immunity to normal infected behavioral programming. The immediate battle was won, but the global war remained far from over. Ashley's disruption of the infected communication network had prevented worldwide coordination but had also scattered infected operations into independent cells that would be harder to track and counter. Jake's rescue had saved most of the human captives, but revealed that the infected possessed transformation capabilities that could create hybrid beings with unpredictable loyalties and abilities. Marcus's military success had demonstrated that infected forces could be defeated through superior tactics and firepower, but only when humans possessed detailed intelligence about their operations and could achieve strategic surprise. Dr. Kellerman's partial transformation became humanity's greatest source of hope and their most troubling concern. Her hybrid status allowed her to understand infected thinking patterns while retaining human emotional connections, providing insights into enemy psychology that could revolutionize resistance strategies. But her very existence proved that the infected could create beings that bridged the gap between human and infected capabilities, suggesting that the future might belong neither to unmodified humans nor to traditional infected, but to hybrid beings that combined the best aspects of both species. As survivors regrouped and assessed their situation, they realized that the war for humanity's future had entered a new phase where the definitions of human and infected were no longer clear, and victory might require becoming something entirely different from what either side had been before.